Our second panel discussion today is going to be focused on careers that are perhaps a bit more unexpected in terms of someone having a background in physics. Like we did this morning, I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves and talk a little bit about how they went from physics to their chosen career. And then we'll move on to some of the questions that we've had sent in to us by you and that we've prepared. But throughout the session, I'll encourage you to take advantage and ask questions at any time. Again, we're going to have those microphones that you can just toss on to each other. Because we're not going to have a longish lunch like we did before, make sure to take advantage of this time to ask questions, because our speakers are likely going to be moving on right after the session. So let's dive in. I'll have each of you introduce yourselves, tell a little bit about starting from when you were studying physics all the way up to today. Nipun, how about if we start with you?
Okay, sure. So I'm Nipon Bots. I work at the Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development in Ottawa, so government department, and my job right now is one where I'm responsible for the policy and the development of programs that fund basic research in research institutions across the country. So there is a bit of a link to my physics past. So places like this, places like NSERC and SHERC and CFI, my group is responsible for kind of thinking through how to optimize the investments in those areas, what kind of programs sort of reflect the reality of how research is being done and that sort of thing. So in terms of my trajectory to get here, I was someone who, as an undergraduate, when I was starting my degree, I took a whole bunch of different courses. I was not someone who was kind of specifically drawn to physics in my freshman year, but I found it to be the most challenging subject. And being an arrogant young person, I thought, I'm going to major in that one because I don't really get it. And so as I sort of pursued that, I found, as most of you I'm sure have, that it's a pretty fascinating area. You learn about, quantum theory, general relativity. Wow, this is great. And then I kind of, I was pretty good at it. So I went to grad school and I went and did my PhD in theoretical quantum optics at U of T in the mid-90s. And then at a certain point in that, I kind of realized that I feel as though you probably, to do this well for your life, you need to be called to it. Like, it's a bit like the priesthood, I kind of think of it as. Like, it's, you don't have to be celibate, but you do have to kind of, although sometimes you may feel that way, but you do need to kind of have a real calling to do it, a certain kind of a passion and a drive that where you can see yourself kind of 20 years from now being happy pursuing those kinds of intellectual problems. And I didn't have that kind of attraction to the field. I thought it was intellectually really interesting. I enjoyed it, but it wasn't really what I saw myself doing. And at the same time as I was doing my PhD, I kind of, being a theorist and not chained to a lab, I kind of got to dabble in some things out in the community and in society, and realized through interactions with other people, through kind of getting involved, mentioning to some of the co-panelists, I wrote for a magazine as a graduate student, that there were these careers in something called public policy. And I equated that with the stuff that I would read all these newspapers and then go to the bar and talk to my friends about the issues of the day. Then I realized you could actually get paid to do that. And that sort of wasn't something that I actually ever thought about as I was kind of pursuing my physics training. So I finished my PhD in physics, and then I felt that I really wanted to take the leap into a completely different area, where I felt that at least for myself, I felt that I could do things that were maybe a bit more directly relevant to society from my perspective. And so I did something that just horrified my mother, which is I went back to school. And after doing a PhD, I did another 2 years of study in public policy. So I did a degree in public policy at the Woodrow Wilson School, and loved it. Like, it was the first point in my sort of trajectory where I actually made a conscious decision that this was something that I felt called to do, and pursued it. And from there, through a series of, again, random kind of interactions by kind of putting yourself out there, I ended up in Ottawa about 16 years ago, and had a series of jobs that were just fascinating and you know, brought in some analytical skills, but also just the people dimension of how decisions get made. And worked in a range of areas, none of which had anything to do with science until this last job, which I'm in now. And I did that consciously to kind of make sure I wasn't sort of the science guy, that I actually was kind of getting a breadth of experience that I wanted to get in a career like this. And so that's how I've now sort of come full circle into kind of the science sphere again, but as a policy person rather than a scientist. Although I am married to a physics professor, so I still have that.
Thank you. Justin?
Sure. So my name is Justin Malecki, and my current gig is with the Ontario Energy Board. They're they regulate electricity and natural gas in Ontario. So we sort of make sure everyone's playing fairly with the shared energy infrastructure in the province, making sure people aren't overcharged, and making sure everyone's compensated well. And so I work as a policy advisor in the strategic policy unit there. And so I'm kind of looking a little bit more forward at sort of possible changes to the laws, to different regulations, and how we can regulate that energy better. So the research side does have a quantitative component. It involves a lot of that sort of economic analysis, but also a lot of sort of communication to the senior leadership in the OEB. And before that, I worked for the government, so sort of providing advice to the government and communicating sort of the results of these research and looking at different policy options and what the expected outcomes of them will be and what costs they have, and et cetera. So I guess in my capacity here, I'm happy to talk about sort of life in public policy as a civil servant, similar to Nipun here, and but also I can talk to sort of life in the energy industry that I've worked in for the last 7 years or 8 years now. To tell you my origin story, I did my undergraduate here at the University of Waterloo, where I also did some undergraduate research with Lee Smolin here at the Perimeter Institute. Well, not here, it was on King Street at the time, but then I went on to UBC to do my PhD in condensed matter physics. And similar to what you were saying, sort of by the end of my PhD, I've also felt that to really dive into an academic career took, a lot of focus in one area, and you needed to have some independent drive for that. I felt that I didn't have. I was very interested in a lot of different things and liked working on challenging problems and was good at it. And I like working on things that I was good at, but it just didn't seem like the path for me. And so from there, I was kind of sat back and kind of looked at the world and where there seemed to be need of some help, sort of globally, and found my way eventually to energy issues in general, and certainly sort of related to climate change and whatnot. And moved back to Ontario, moved to Toronto, and just kind of started just generally out there, all right, energy world, whatever that meant. And I didn't know at the time, what do you got? And so I started, networking as best as I could, also doing a lot of independent research and writing and whatnot, none of which I got paid for about 6 months. But then I found a job at a very small startup called Clear Sky Advisors. They were a renewable energy market research firm, and landed a short-term contract that did not pay very much. It was very humbling, but it got me my start, and I certainly learned a lot about the industry, a lot about renewable energy and whatnot there, and also excelled applying a lot of my analytical skills and whatnot. So after 3.5 years there, I left to work with, there's another Perimeter Institute connection here. The former executive director here, Howard Burton, reached out to me. He was starting up a new thing called Ideas Roadshow, which was, and still is, what I'll call long-form TED Talks in conversation format, for lack of a better word. So he was just starting it up, so I worked together with him as sort of the chief operating officer in Toronto, helping to get that off the ground. and that's still going, and that's great. And then from there, a friend of mine, a former colleague, reached out, told me about a job at the Ontario Ministry of Energy. I knew him very well, and that was my sort of first entree into sort of the public service, working there for the Ontario Ministry of Energy, providing advice on mostly electricity issues in the province to the government. There, it started off as kind of a very standard public policy job. I was writing briefing notes on various topics that went up. But eventually, I think, as my skill set sort of became wider known, I started working on more quantitative problems. Eventually, I found myself sort of designing and developing a computer simulation of the electricity market in Ontario in order to sort of quantitatively assess various policies and whatnot, which is something that wasn't very common, at the Ministry of Energy, but was something that was very desired at the highest level. And so I developed that over a couple of years and got that started before I then found my way to the Ontario Energy Board, which is where I started and where I am now, and where I've been for the last 2 years.
Great, thank you. Stephanie.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Keating. Those of you who are from Perimeter probably already know me. I'm a science writer here. So what I do in my role is, a big part of it is taking the work of the researchers here and sort of making it more accessible to the general public, because we have a very interested audience. People love physics. Some people love physics, and the people that love physics really love physics, and they want to know more. It's really inherently interesting. So a big part of what I get to do is take the really cool stuff that people are working on here and translate it into something that your mom or your grandma might be able to understand. So that's one part of my job. I also work on things like internal communications. There's annual reports. We do advancement proposals, so basically asking donors to help build Perimeter up. And sometimes I help with grant and award nominations, so there's kind of a really wide variety of things that I get to do. My trajectory here is actually very similar to what we've heard before. In high school, I was interested in all kinds of different things, but physics I found the most challenging. And I guess I wouldn't say it was arrogance that drew me to it, but it was sort of I kind of thought, well, if you're going to pay for an education, it might as well be with something that I find kind of challenging and difficult to sort of learn on my own. Little did I know that when you get to university, you do a lot of learning on your own. But I still found it really fascinating and interesting. So I did my undergrad at Western University in London on astrophysics, and then did a master's in astronomy as well, and then went on to the University of Toronto for my PhD. And partway through my PhD, I had the same realization where I sort of knew that while I enjoyed the research, it wasn't something that I felt compelled to keep on doing. Particularly, it wasn't something that I felt strong enough about to push through the sort of challenging path that an academic can take. So moving wherever your postdoc will take you and not having much say in that, and then fighting tooth and nail for whatever faculty positions might be available and potentially ending up, I don't know, somewhere in the Midwest or something. No offense to the Midwest, but I kind of wanted to have a little bit more say in where I wanted to live. And so while I was doing my PhD, I got really actively involved in doing outreach. So well, first of all, I did a lot of TAing, and I loved it. I really enjoyed leading tutorials. I ended up kind of rebuilding the whole way that we did tutorials for the Astro 101 course, which was like this huge, massive 500-person course that all the art students took, because it was an easy science credit. So they were very scared of physics and astronomy, but they were still curious. And so I kind of got a sense of what it was like to do that kind of outreach and communication and share with people who didn't have a physics background. I also co-founded the Toronto chapter of Astronomy on Tap, which is you go into a bar, and there are three, in this case, astronomers, who give 5-minute talks that are very short and very accessible. There's lots of glow sticks and lights flashing. And then you kind of sit down and have a conversation over beers and talk about the cool things that are happening in the land of astronomy, which was basically what I was doing anyways. I would go out for drinks with my soccer team, and they'd be like, hey, Steph, tell me about black holes. And so now that's kind of what I get to do here. In the interim, I did a maternity leave cover, actually for Kelly here, in the educational outreach department. So Perimeter has a strong outreach mandate where we want to share the excitement of physics with teachers and their students, and really empower teachers to take that excitement and bring it into their classrooms. And a lot of teachers don't have a strong physics background, so Perimeter has resources to help bring things like dark matter into the classroom. And then from there, there was an opening in the publications department, and it turns out that I also really like writing. In fact, my master's, the first draft of my master's paper, I submitted it, I was super proud of it, and my master's supervisor looked at it and she said, Steph, this is great. You can't write like this for an academic paper. You've really got to tone this language down. Because I was excited about it, and I wanted to use words like, the black hole is devouring matter. She said, no, you can't. You can't talk about it like that. But I get to talk about it like that now. So I'm really happy to be able to still have sort of one foot in the academic world where I get to keep on top of all the really exciting science that's happening. But also, I don't have to do the really exciting science. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Ted.
My name's Ted Shew. When I was a graduate student in physics, I remember that I was always interested in reading and learning about different subjects, either in science or outside of science. But I also remember hearing about some graduate students who were a couple of years ahead of me going into the financial field and thinking, well, that's strange. Why would you do a whole PhD at Princeton, where I was a graduate student, and then right away go off and work in the financial field? Because as a graduate student, I had fully expected to be on this academic track, and that someday I would continue to do work in the research area, condensed matter, that I was working in. In the early 1990s, so I think none of the panelists have had to go back that far in history yet. So, but anyways, in the early 1990s, when I had done some postdocs, I realized that I didn't want to keep doing postdocs. And the early 1990s was a tough time, I think, for certain areas of academia, because there was a recession in the very early 90s, and it was a slow recovery from that recession, especially in the job market. And then the Iron Curtain had fallen a couple of years previously. So, competing for academic jobs is often, it's a global competition. And so I had remembered that there had been these people who had gone into finance, and I had a couple of friends who had gone into the financial world. And so I was able to overcome that barrier of thinking that the academic track was what I always wanted to do, which it was. And I made the decision to move into a different field. So I moved into finance. One of the reasons I think why I got the job was that when I was working in physics, I kind of did a little side thing supervising some high school students on a summer project. And of course, it would have been hard for them to work in condensed matter theory, which was what I was working on. But I had them work on another kind of many-body problem, and that was a many-body kind of game theory problem, a many-body prisoner's dilemma problem. And I remember we made some pretty videos of that. And I was able to use that video to complement the interview that I did for my first job in finance. And I think that kind of impressed people, because I interviewed at a trading firm, a market-making firm. And the principals of that firm were they thought a lot about game theory and how to use that to trade efficiently and manage risk. So that's how I got my first job. And another reason why I think I got my first job in finance is because I did a lot of numerical simulations. So I did a lot of programming. And if you can do programming, at least back then, you could be immediately useful, which meant that I could sort of pay my own tuition. So I could learn a new field, but be immediately useful and pay my own way, in a sense. And I think that was important for getting my foot in the door. I worked for 9 years in finance, and I had also the good fortune to be hired by a firm which was just about to be taken over by the French bank, Banque Nationale de Paris. And because I grew up in Canada, and because I grew up in Trudeau Senior's Canada, and my parents really liked the idea of bilingualism. I remember my dad saying, listen, you've got to learn French in addition to Chinese, because you've got to learn French because you're Canadian, and Pierre Trudeau says you should learn both official languages. So I was able to be the person. I was working in Philadelphia, and there's not that many French speakers in the firm in Philadelphia. So I was chosen as the person who would go to Paris and work in the Paris trading room of BNP. There's a lot of little coincidences, a lot of side skills and knowledge that I had, not in physics, that helped me move step by step into different paths in my career. I worked for 9 years, and my last 4 years were spent managing a group, which is not something that I got any training for as a physicist. But nevertheless, it's something that I did, that I kind of learned on the job. And after 9 years, I got married, we had a kid, and it was time for a change. I was able to spend a couple of years as a stay-at-home dad and kind of go outside of my comfort zone again and learn about different things while my wife went back to graduate school. I took care of our little daughter. And at that time, I got interested in yet another thing. I remember my wife telling me about these trading markets for carbon offsets. And I was thinking, oh my goodness, I didn't know you could trade those things. And so I learned about that. I learned about the significance of climate change as a problem. And so I had some time to think and read, and I got interested in public policy. And part of that, I think, is related to having a kid, too. You have a baby, you're starting to think about 10, 20, 50 years ahead, and you start thinking about the things that they're going to have to worry about. So demographic shifts. At that time, in the early 2000s, it was, I think, a real problem in the financial markets, especially around housing. But climate change is one of those very long-term things that you worry a lot about when you're thinking about your kids, because, you can change their diapers and play with them and teach them things, but it's not going to deal with the really big things that they might have to face later on in life. So that was what got me into my next stage. So I had the luxury of being able to move back to my hometown, which is Kingston, just 4 hours east of here. And I decided I had the luxury of looking around, seeing what I wanted to do, and I worked for a not-for-profit association called Switch. It's a sustainable energy association. So I was the executive director of that. And I worked there for about 3 or 4 years. It's an association that's kind of professional and business focused. So I was able to work with a lot of businesses and researchers and students and public institutions in the area of sustainable energy. And I had the luxury also of getting involved in politics for the very first time. And again, another accident in 2006 when I decided, you know what, if I'm interested in public policy and if I want to do something about it, then maybe I need to get involved in politics. And at that time, the Liberal Party of Canada, which had just been defeated in the election, had a very wide open leadership race. And these leadership races and nomination races and things like that, those are times when parties are very open to new people coming in Canada anyways. And so I got involved, and there were a lot of doors open because it was such a wide open leadership race. I got involved, and several years later, when the sitting member of Parliament announced his retirement in Kingston and the Islands, my hometown, I decided, well, I have something different to offer. And this is kind of where the physics background comes in, because it's a pretty rare background. And so I had physics background, I had experience outside of physics in the capital markets, in running a not-for-profit association. And because I had the luxury of moving back to my hometown, I also had a community where I was known, and people knew my family, and I had teachers, and I had friends who could talk about me. And I decided to run for the nomination of the Liberal Party in Kingston and the Islands. And I was running against 4 other people in the community for the nomination. There was the dean of the law school, the mayor, and a couple of lawyers. I was former city councillor and another lawyer who's teaching at Queen's University. And I won, I think, because I was living in my hometown. And I had a lot of people who knew me or my family or my friends and all the people I encountered. It's just really important in our system of government, where you have local representatives, to have people who are known by the community and who are accountable to the people they encounter in the streets every day, or they have to encounter in the streets every day. So I got elected in 2011 as the Member of Parliament for Kingston and the Islands. And when I was a Member of Parliament, I was able to use my science background because, in fact, I was the only, I think at the time I was elected, I was the only person to ever have a PhD in natural sciences in the House of Commons. So having a different background means that you can participate in discussions about policy, even though you don't really know that much and you don't have that much experience, but you're different. So you can participate. And I was able to bring a quantitative and scientific approach to different topics, whether it was Corrections Canada. So you might not know that Corrections, which is responsible for our prison system and all the rehabilitation and around our inmates, it has a lot of data. So you can do a lot of things with that data. I was also able to be, so I was the science and technology critic, but if you're the science and technology critic, if you're the science guy, you can participate in discussions about the environment, about natural resources, about energy policy, about industrial policy. So it was a way for me to get involved and talk about those things. And I tended to take a quantitative approach to things. And one of the examples of that, which I'm very proud of, is that there was a debate over the tax-free savings account. So it's nothing to do with science, right? Tax-free savings account. So the other side of the floor, people were using an argument which turns out to be about statistics, which turned out to be actually wrong and misleading. But I was able to take, now it wasn't completely my idea because a constituent of mine phoned me up and said, you know, he made an offhand remark and he didn't explain it, but he said, you can figure it out. I know you can. So I said, well, what are you talking about? So I took this offhand remark, and then I realized what he was talking about, that this statistical argument was wrong. So I was able to very quickly go to Statistics Canada, take the data, give the argument, write a blog, show why this statistical argument was wrong, and write it in a way so that the next day I could get a reporter to write a story about it. And also to convince my colleagues in the House of Commons that my argument was correct and that argument was wrong, and use it in debate over the next few days. And I'm particularly proud of that. The last thing I'll say as a member of parliament was every member of parliament, almost every member of parliament, gets to introduce a piece of private legislation called the Private Members Bill. So I decided to do something which probably was going to fail in that the legislation was not going to pass. But that was to introduce a bill to restore the long-form census, which is the census that asks a whole bunch of questions besides where do you live, how many people are in your house, and so on. And I'm most proud of that because I made the restoration of the long-form census and all the data that it gives to researchers and people who want to make public policy based on evidence, to restore the data collection that had been canceled in order to save, well, sort of to save money, although it didn't really save money. So that's one of the things that I'm most proud of. And since 2015, when I decided not to run again, I kind of wanted to run again, but it wasn't right for my family. I've been able to continue in public policy. I'm currently co-chairing the mayor of Kingston's task force on housing, which doesn't really require a science background, but it requires a political and policy background. And I've also spent a lot of time coaching my daughter's robotics team, which is probably the thing that allows me to use a lot of skills that I acquired as a physicist, because I get to make pieces out of aluminum in the machine shop and teach other kids how to do that and do programming, and it's rewarding to work with kids as long as they're willing to learn. So I have had a very, not only non-traditional path, but a very windy path. And I guess my main thing to leave with you is that you shouldn't be afraid of that either.
Thank you. I think both you and Stephanie talked a little bit about how you built in, along your way, like physics, those little tidbits of like, here I was drawing on my science, and obviously in writing, you're drawing on that background. Maybe Nipun and Justin, do you want to talk about how, like, do you use your physics much in your day-to-day job now? Or are there aspects of that career that you feel are useful? I think you also mentioned a little bit, Justin, but maybe we'll start back here.
So I'm a public servant. So no, I'm not on the political side. I'm in the bureaucracy, and in those kinds of roles, particularly when you work in the area of policy, which is sort of how do you, it's really hard to articulate what policy is, but it's kind of the directions that a government is going to take to achieve certain kinds of objectives, and then what kind of tools would you use to do that, be they legislation or spending or regulations or other kinds of tools. I've had a range of jobs. One of the fun things about being in the bureaucracy is it's a little like playing dress up. Like you have a base set of skills that you apply to a range of different things. So I've had jobs where, for example, I led a group that ran the programs that transfer funds from the federal government to the provinces. So you've probably heard about the equalization program, or the money that goes to provinces for healthcare or for social spending. In that kind of a job, there's a huge amount of data that goes into that, because when you talk about a program like equalization, what it's meant to do is to provide for relatively comparable services in different provinces at relatively comparable levels of taxation. How do you measure that? So in that job, I had a team of economists, tons of data from StatsCan, and being numerate and being a physicist, and also having, what's interesting about economists is they look down on most, but they don't look down on physicists, right? They actually aspire to be physicists in a way. So you have credibility with that group. So credibility, numeracy, and the ability to kind of pinpoint where the questions are that you need to ask to actually get to the solution are pretty important. And then being able to translate a complex kind of a calculation into language that a minister can understand, or that just the general public can understand, is also another skill that maybe we don't emphasize enough in a graduate physics education, but is a very valuable skill for those of you who've worked on it. So that's an example. In other jobs, it's been less the case. One of the things I would say is that what I find really interesting and rich about working in public policy is you have this foundation of analysis that you can bring to bear on a problem, but then you have to overlay on that the fact that people have values they bring to the discussion. People have a range of perspectives, and you have to try and kind of find the best solution you can given the history that people bring to an issue. and so there's the objective function is complex. Like it's not, there's no right or wrong answer. There's the informing it by evidence, but then you have to kind of overlay the fact that you're dealing with a human element. And so it's that collision between the two that matters. And I guess the last thing I would say is, just going back to credibility, you get this, in some cases you get this aura of credibility just by having a graduate degree, like a PhD in physics intimidates some people. and they will grudgingly listen to what you have to say because you've got that kind of a credential behind your name, rightly or wrongly. And in the job I'm in right now, because I interface a lot with the universities, having done done a PhD and having spent so much time in school, it's helpful in having the dialogue with, when you're talking to vice presidents of universities or researchers at universities, having done that actually means that you understand what they are dealing with, and that you can cut through the fact that you are a bureaucrat from Ottawa and actually talk honestly about what you need to do to kind of advance knowledge. So that's also valuable.
Yeah, I would, I mean, that echoes a lot of how I feel I've applied, sort of what I've learned as a physicist in my job. I'm a little bit more sort of on the ground doing the actual research, and I find that I think where I apply my physics skills most is not so much in the actual knowledge that I gained through my education, but having sort of a comfort and a confidence with technical matters and with calculation. So I do a lot of quantitative analysis in my policy research, but it's not anything that requires a PhD in physics. Anybody with an undergraduate degree in engineering or economics or math or anything like that could do the exact same thing, but I think what I bring is sort of a confidence of knowing how to apply it, understanding where, when and how valuable that quantitative analysis will be, understanding the limitations of it, and being able to do it very quickly, and being able to communicate it with confidence, knowing that the level to which I trust the outcomes of that. And I have a lot of colleagues with a wide range of skills who are better at a lot of things than me, better than me at a lot of things. But a lot of them are scared of whenever there's numbers or calculations to be done, or if they're asked to do something on a very technical matter. And whereas I think that my training and my experience just gives me that comfort and confidence so that I can just sort of do my job more effectively there than if I didn't have that education or had less education there.
Could I just pick up on that? I mean, I think one of the things that is, if you do a PhD in physics, you're not afraid of complex problems, right? That's a fundamental kind of skill that you have, is that, people can throw a very complex problem at you, and you're not going to run away from it. You're like, okay, well, how do we kind of break this down into something we can actually figure out? And that's, maybe you don't need a PhD to do that, but the discipline of doing a PhD sure teaches you how to kind of work your way through something. So that is a valuable skill.
Ted, you wanted to add something too?
Yeah, it sort of follows on that remark, but so I said that I'm currently the co-chair of the Mayor of Kingston's task force on housing, which on the face of it is not a scientific thing. But what I bring to that, I still bring something from physics to that. What I bring is an attitude towards a problem, which is a tight housing market in Kingston. And the attitude that I'm going to go and study this problem, and I'm going to actually not just rely on the experts that we bring in, but I'm going to go and do some research on my own and ask people things that, in order to understand better. And because the idea is, because I'm a physicist, I figure I can understand something and maybe come up with a solution or a part of a solution that I wouldn't otherwise. And I'm reminded by that, I don't know, so some of you were alive in the late 80s when the space shuttle exploded, and there was a blue ribbon panel put together to investigate. And if you remember, one of the panel members was Richard Feynman, and he kind of didn't follow the normal procedures. He didn't conform to the institutional way of doing blue ribbon panel investigations. Instead, he went and talked to the engineers and realized that there was a problem with the O-rings when they got cold. And you might remember that he did this press conference where he dipped the rubber O-ring into a glass of ice water and demonstrated how they became stiff and not able to contain the high pressure gases inside the rocket. So I think that physicists are valuable because of that effort, and they can kind of they can complement the sort of systematic way that institutions sometimes attack problems by this sort of investigative researcher, maybe confidence or big ego or just overconfident way of saying, I'm going to try to understand this on my own, and something good will come out of it. Yeah.
Great. Questions from our audience there at this time? Yeah. Sure.
Sure. Here.
Everyone's too nervous to throw it. Just throw it.
I know.
Patty. Okay, ready? There you go.
Yeah, so this goes back to a little bit what Ted was saying about bilingualism. So in a public policy degree in Canada, would you say that it is an asset to be bilingual, or if I am much better speaking English than French, would I still be able to do the same jobs as someone else who is completely bilingual?
Do you want me to take that?
Do you want to take a stab at that?
So I'm also a child of the Trudeau senior generation, so I learned French too in school. But I would say in Canada, we don't have quite the same diversity of public policy organizations as we do in some other countries like the US. So I would argue that, you know, spending time in the federal government in some way or connected to the federal government is actually quite an asset. Whether you stay there for a career or not, if you're going to work in policy, that's an important dimension of how we work. And in the federal system, for sure, your career prospects are limited if you are not bilingual. Like that's definitely true. And you know, I think it is. I mean, you're serving Canadians, and so there's a reason for that, right? So that, not to say that you can't do, like, there are other organizations and other places in Canada you can do things, but I think that is an important part of a public policy kind of career. So I don't know if Ted has anything to say on that. Or
No, nothing to add. But
Yeah, I would say that at the provincial level in Ontario, it's not as much of a requirement, at least in my experience, that it's predominantly English work that is done in the public service, because that's the predominant language here, and I imagine it's probably similar in other provinces. It would probably match the language makeup of the residents of that province, and similar down to the municipal level. There depend on the language that's in the municipality. So it's not so much of a requirement, bilingualism.
Maybe building on that question a little bit, you know, hearing all of your paths, it sounded like there was definitely more than physics eventually that led to the career, whether it was knowing French or whether it was doing an extra bit of education or running starting an outreach programming. If you think about the work as either in the public sector or in writing and being elected, what are some things that a student should be thinking about building into their experience that could help them make that transition? Anybody want to start? And then we can kind of, if anybody wants to chime in.
I mean, I would say personally, I wasn't very deliberate about it. Like I don't think like the way I approached it was, you know, I enjoyed my research, but I wanted to kind of be exposed to other things, like throughout even my graduate education. So, you know, I interacted with a range of people from other disciplines, or I got this writing gig because they were asking for someone to write an article when Stephen Hawking visited U of T at one point. And I said, sure, I'll give that a try. And they didn't take my article, but they kind of the magazine took me under their wing and said, you know, why don't you become our Science and Society editor? So sure, I'll do that. exposed me to a whole other kind of, path, right? Like, so, and then even when I was doing my public policy degree, it's chance encounters. It's like putting yourself out there and learning about different kinds of things that often, if you're open to them, can kind of open different doors. I think there's a bit of that. And I think it is very, it's understandable if you are dedicated to a research project that you kind of spend your time focused on it, because you kind of have to. But to the extent that you're kind of asking yourself, like, is this what I want to do for the rest of my life? I think unless you actually expose yourself to a range of other things that you may be passionate about, you'll never really kind of know, and you'll never really have those other opportunities. So I think it is that element that's important.
Yeah, I would say take advantage of whatever opportunities you have available. So when I was at U of T, there was a free science journalism course that we could sign up for through the School of Graduate Studies, and it was taught by Ivan Semenuk, who's a fantastic science journalist. And so I was like, yeah, okay, I'll take that. It was, it wasn't super in depth, but it was something that sort of interested me, and it turns out that it actually really interests me. And then so there's opportunities there if you look for them. And then if there aren't those opportunities, or you're not finding something that really catches your interest, you can make your own. Start, if you're really passionate about sharing your interest in, I don't know, physics or something non-physics, you really like yo-yoing, start a yo-yo club. Just follow those.
Not a great career option.
Maybe not a great career option, but I don't know, you never know, right?
You might meet somebody there, yeah. So.
Well, earlier this morning we heard about how you can get, maybe a job if you were just interacting with the dog. So maybe in the yo-yo club you'll meet somebody, and you never know, right? There's going to be all kinds of connections.
Yeah, I would say, and this was touched on a lot in the morning, so I don't want to belabor the point, but if there's a, a field outside of physics or a subject matter that you are interested in, that you want to pursue, at least, or at least try out, it's one thing to, read up on it, take courses, learn about what's going on in that field, but I think just as important is to just be active in that field, and, and it helps to like put something out there that other people can interact with. So this morning they were talking about, if you want to get into machine learning or whatever, work on a project and put it on GitHub, for example. For me, because I was like interested in sustainable energy and whatnot, but didn't know anything about it, I started reading about it and learning it. But then I also created the blog and would actually, research a specific topic with the purpose of writing an article about it, and that really helped to focus that learning and whatnot. But in addition to that, another thing that was hammered home this morning was the importance of networking and whatnot. And by having something out there, by being active in a field, not necessarily professionally, not at the, the highest level, but at least it gives you something to talk about when you're networking. Networking can be scary, it can be tricky when you don't have a lot of experience in the field, but it's one thing to be, hey, I have all these skills and I'm looking for a job. It's another thing to say, hey, I have all these skills and I wrote this cool article that I want to talk to you about. So you can give a little and take a little, and you can feel a little bit more comfortable in those networking situations, show that you're actively interested in it. And I even used the blog as an excuse to interview somebody who was working on a really cool project, and said, hey, I want to interview you and work on a project, and then gave a chance to network with him as well. So I think, there's lots of opportunities to get out there with social media and whatnot. It doesn't have to be super professional. It doesn't have to be, research quality. I think that's really hard for a lot of us with our training, where, you don't want to put anything out there that you're not 100% on, but the real world is a lot more forgiving. And not saying you should make stuff up by any means, but just a simple article can go a long way with helping bridge that gap and sort of have those conversations. At least it helped me.
Just a kind of add-on on that, I'm reminded of the nerdiest dating advice I ever heard as a grad student, which was someone said, you need to increase your cross-section. And I think and I think it applies to kind of pursuing other kind of fields as well, right? You need to kind of increase your cross-section of things you're exposed to. So it's a bit of that.
Great. Other questions from, yeah, over here, if we can pass the mic.
Throw the mic. It's really light.
I want to throw it.
Yeah, I had two questions. One is regarding policy, government policies. So I was wondering, there was some discussion about how your skill set that you learned because being part of the physics community helps you in your jobs. This question is to Ted and Nipun. But I was wondering also how having been part of a physics community helps you, not the skill set, but the notion of being part of that community in the past helps you in helping with government policy, especially education sector in some sense. The other question I had was for Stephanie, and I was wondering how science communication has changed with the onset of anyone can make a blog now. So how does that change the job market for a person who wants to make it a career?
So the first question that you had was about not so much the skills that a physicist use, but having a community of physicists that you have connections with. How does that, am I phrasing your question right?
Not just community in the sense of the network, but that being part of your identity. So like if you've gone through an education system, you probably know better what are probably the policies that should be improved in the education sector, and does that inform in that sense?
Yeah, okay.
So I can address that, the first question, but in a very particular way. So when I was a member of parliament, I was an opposition critic for science and technology. And just as a particular example, so at that time there were changes to funding for research equipment, so for repairing research equipment. In order to understand better the effects of the change of that policy and to be able to criticize the government better, I was very fortunate to be able to phone up old friends in the physics community and talk to them about how it would affect their laboratories. And having been an academic, I also found it very easy to speak to researchers in other disciplines, because I understood the idea of what a lab was like, what graduate students did, what postdocs did, what one had to do to get funding, and generally speaking, how laboratories worked and the culture. So that was a very direct application of my academic experience.
Yeah. Anybody else want to add anything, or?
I mean, so this sort of addresses the misinterpretation of the question of like, does the physics community, how does that help you? And I guess like, you know, we heard this morning that you know, your professors and your supervisors aren't always the best mentors to go into the private sector or the public sector. But it doesn't hurt to ask either. So for me, after I graduated from UBC in Vancouver and moved back to Ontario, I reached out to Lee Smolin, who I'd worked with previously, and told him kind of where I was at. We just had a quick chat, and I told him I was interested in energy issues, but also curious about science writing and was thinking about pursuing a career there. He put me in touch with a science journalist in Toronto who had been sort of recruited for a job that he didn't want, but told me about it, and that's how I sort of got my foot in the door at Clear Sky Advisors, and boom, I followed the random walk that got me to where I got to. So, you know, it doesn't hurt to ask. You never know who knows who, and, you know, if there's something you're curious about or, you know, a path you want to pursue, you know, use all the resources you have, including, you know, people who aren't necessarily in that field, because you never know who knows who.
Good. Stephanie, did you want to tackle question two?
So the question was basically how have blogs affected science communication? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, now anyone can make a blog or post on social media, and that has changed
Yeah, I think, well, for one, my personal opinion is that blogs are a wonderful supplement to sort of the mainstream science journalism, science communication. I don't think that they're a replacement for it. There's a big difference between me reading a paper and blogging about it sort of independently versus me reading a paper, talking to the researchers that wrote the paper, writing up an article, having it go through the editorial process, going back to the researchers to say, is this okay, is this all right, versus me just kind of saying, oh, I think this journal paper says this. That said, I think it's fantastic to have researchers blog about their research. I think that part of the reason I got into science outreach and science communication was that I think that science illiteracy or science fear too are huge issues in today's society. And I think that people sharing their research and making it accessible is only a good thing. I don't know if that addresses your question.
Yeah, it does.
Okay. And I don't know if anybody has anything else to add, maybe.
We talked a little bit about this in the green room. Like, we've talked about how physics has definitely helped everyone in their career, but I think a few of you mentioned some anecdotes where, you know, going from the physics research environment and then entering the real world, there were some surprises along the way. I don't know if anybody wanted to share some of those thoughts that we chatted briefly with earlier.
Sure, I'll start. So one of the challenges that I find, not just amongst physicists, but with more broadly with people who sort of get their first job directly out of school, is that a lot of their research, you know, is in depth, and you learn everything possible about a problem before you publish, and you have a lot of time to do that, and you don't publish until it's done. Whereas in the real world, you have deadlines, and oftentimes those deadlines are much shorter than you would like to produce sort of that perfect thing. And so when I first started working at Clear Sky Advisors and sort of was writing my first reports, and I was really excited to do the research, and the research was going really well, but then it came time to publish, and I was like, well, we don't know these things for sure. We only have, you know, a limited data set, or we only surveyed so many people, et cetera, et cetera. But it, you know, it came time, we had to put it out. And that was really difficult to kind of manage that. You felt like you were sort of sacrificing your intellectual integrity in a lot of ways, and so there'd be a lot of pushback. Now, with more experience under my belt, I look back on that and I see that, you know, our clients didn't need that level of determination and that level of veracity for what we were doing. They needed, you know, some directional indications to help them make the decisions that they needed to make. And so by gold plating those reports, it would have been completely wasteful, and all of that extra work we would have done would have been completely wasted. And so sort of just coming to terms with, you know, understanding your audience, understanding your clients, knowing what is needed and what isn't was kind of difficult, rather than just doing the sort of absolute best job every time. Can be a challenge, and something that people have to learn. I know that was mentioned this morning as well.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to add, which is changing the topic just a little bit, but it's related to the discussion this morning, and it's about how to choose a job to go into. I think that, especially when you work in the private sector, things can change very quickly. So you can be working on one thing and then be working on something else 6 months later. I think that if you have the choice, when you take a job in the private sector, it's more important who you work for than what exactly you work on. Because what exactly you work on is almost guaranteed to change over the next few years. But who you work for can affect a lot how happy you are on the job, how much you learn, because some managers are better coaches and mentors than others. And during the interview process, you should be, I think, deciding if you want to work for this person or not. Do you get along? Are you going to work on him? Are you going to be mentored? Are you going to be happy working with this person? Do you communicate well? And so my advice would be a little bit different from what was discussed this morning, and that is pick the person you want to work for, and not so much exactly what the job is about.
Just picking up on that, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, you're talking about the sort of the shock to the system from leaving physics. I mean, I think what I've found is in kind of reflecting on a physics training and what I'm doing in my job and even in private sector, public sector, you kind of ask yourself, like, what is it that a graduate student is, what is a graduate student rewarded for? Graduate student is rewarded for their intellectual effort, what they achieve themselves in advancing knowledge, right? If you're successful as a graduate student and you follow the traditional career path and you become a prof, what do you do when you're a prof? You are managing resources, you're managing people, you're managing relationships, you have administrative responsibilities, right? All things that, at least when I was going to grad school, you did not get trained for at all. Those are the same kinds of skills you need to succeed in any kind of context, right? Like they're, whether you're a professor, whether you are, in a management position in a company, whether you are working in a management position in government. And I think equally so, who's your advisor will actually have a big impact on your quality of life as a graduate student or as a postdoc, right? So I don't think they're not that different in that sense, but I would argue that, if you're thinking about your toolkit and you're not sure whether you want to pursue a career in academia or you want to pursue a career outside of academia, I think developing those other skills will help you be a better researcher or a better manager of research or a better worker in any context. And I think unless it's changed fundamentally, I think it is a weakness of how we train people that we don't put an emphasis on that.
Any other questions for them? Yeah.
Hello. My first question is for Nipon. So you mentioned you pursued a 2-year degree in public policy after you got a PhD degree in physics. I'm wondering what's the thinking process about that, because it's a lot of investment in time, and if I would do the same thing, my mom would be more than horrified. So yeah. Yeah, there was a long pause when I was on the phone with her before she said, "That's great."
What was my thinking process? I had a few factors in mind. So one was, I really felt that if I wanted to sort of, like, I decided to take that path because I felt it was a way that I could make a greater difference to society, right? And as I kind of got involved with people who were doing public policy at a local level, I realized I understood what they were talking about, but I spoke a different language. There were different tools in my toolkit than they had. And so I felt I really needed a strong kind of, having a science training, you want like a fundamental, like strong foundations in terms of understanding like economic theory or political theory or, the kind of different elements that come into it. So I looked for a program that actually provided those strong fundamentals. And then the other part of it was I'd been in school for a long time, and I did not want to incur debt to go back to grad school. And I chose one graduate school for the quality of its education, and because, well, they chose me really, but I applied to them. And the other reason was that the school I went to had this philosophy, and still does, that they don't want people to choose their first job based on the debt they have to repay. So if you feel that you can best contribute to society by working at a low-paying job, helping your local community, that you should be able to pursue that after coming out of their program. And so I liked that flexibility, I liked that philosophy, and fortunately they liked me enough to actually allow me to go there. It was a real privilege to be there. And that was a 2-year program. They had a mid-career program, which is a 1-year program, but I didn't really feel mid-career, even though I was probably the same age as some of the people in that mid-career stream after having done a PhD. So it was, you know, I felt that that grounding, for me at least, was something that gave me the confidence and the tools that I needed to kind of speak very credibly in a public policy environment.
I see. Thank you. And I have another question. This question is probably for everybody. And I'm a very interactive person. I like to talk to different people, talk about like policy, interesting stuff, economics. But as you can tell, I'm not a native speaker of English. If I want to pursue a career in public policy afterwards, after my PhD, how much this language barrier would influence my career?
I don't think that much. I mean, I don't think it should matter that much. In the House of Commons, there's a lot of people who speak with very strong accents because they were born in some other country. And I mean, it doesn't matter because they were chosen by the people to represent them. I don't think, my experience is that I don't think it matters too much. I think you have to be able to communicate well, but if you speak with an accent, I don't think it matters in Canada that much.
And I would almost go the other way and say, yes, you have to be able to write well and speak clearly, like explain yourself, but I think it's an asset, right? Like I think you kind of, what do we each bring to the table, right? When you're developing policy, understanding cultural perspectives and understanding the diversity of views that are out there actually contributes a lot to, you know, understanding how the public will respond to a particular, you know, sort of policy direction. So I think you actually get better policy if you have a more diverse kind of a set of experiences that are coming together to try and come up with the right solution. Because as I said earlier, it's not, there's an element of evidence, but there's also an element of you know, the cultural and cultural perspectives and values that people bring to the table that you need to be sensitive to. So I think it's a real asset. And having an international kind of a connection is also a value. You know, it's a valuable asset.
That's great. Well, I think what we'll do now is we'll have a chance just to give you guys an opportunity to say some closing remarks. As I asked this morning, maybe you can think back to your younger selves when you were doing your PhD or your postdoc, and you know, what kinds of words would you say to that younger you at that stage of the career? Was maybe we'll start at this end.
Okay. So I should have worked more with other people when I was younger, and I should have learned to talk more to other people outside of physics. And I should have been better at setting priorities and working more efficiently. So I think those are some of the things I would tell myself.
That's good.
One thing I wanted to address that we were kind of talking about before, but that I don't think has really been raised, at least not much in this panel, maybe over lunch, was the notion that you're somehow failing if you leave academia, if you choose not to pursue that postdoc path or that professor path. I don't think it's at all a failure, even though I totally felt that way at first when I realized, oh shoot, I don't think that that I really want to continue on this path. There's this, and for me, especially being a woman in physics, you hear all this time about this leaky pipeline, right? At every stage, physics loses, or academia in general, but loses women at every stage. So, you know, there's fewer women who do a PhD, then there's fewer women who do a postdoc, and then fewer women who do go into the tenure track. And I thought, I'm contributing to this by leaving. I am the leaky pipeline, and I felt sort of some guilt about that because I just didn't want to continue, but I felt like I should want to continue. And so I would say, you know, just if it's not what you want to do, that's okay. And there are so many opportunities, as you've seen today. And this only scratches the surface of what you can do. So just don't be afraid, don't be ashamed, don't let anybody make you feel ashamed, because there might be some people that you think look down on you, but there's so many people who have left the field and they're not only doing okay, they're thriving and they're flourishing, and they're living great lives and often very intellectually stimulating and satisfying careers. You can have an intellectually stimulating and satisfying career outside of academia if you want to.
Excuse me. Yeah, I mean, I've heard a lot of really great advice today that I would certainly echo. So I'm going to add a couple new things. I think my first bit of advice would be to be humble. Now, I know that when you're out there looking for a career, you're supposed to really pump yourself up and recognize your strengths, and that's certainly important. But I think on the other hand, especially if you're pursuing areas outside of your expertise, is to be humble and recognize that you're not going to know everything when you're going into it, and that but no one expects you to know everything going into it. But to approach it humbly. When you're talking to people, really listen and learn. I know in my experience, I've come across sometimes, certainly not with everybody, but there can be a certain level of intellectual arrogance amongst physicists where some people think that their education and their skills sort of make them smarter than everybody else. And if you go into that with that attitude into a new field, that can be very off-putting. Whereas if you go in, with curiosity and the desire to learn, I think that's very important. And will also, and also when you're looking for that first job, it may not be the one that you eventually want. You may have to accept a sort of more entry-level position in order to get to where you want to go. And that was certainly the case for me. But without that entry-level job, I wouldn't have got to where I was. And it was a humbling experience when I got that first job. But I think that's an important skill to have if you're going to look for a job outside of your area of expertise. And I think the second point, a little bit related to yours, is, and I don't want to talk about this too much on a career trajectory day, but I would say, chill out when it comes to your job. Sometimes. It's one aspect of your life, and certainly it's a very important aspect of your life, but it's not your entire life, and it doesn't have to be your entire life. There's a lot of things outside of your job and what you do for money that can lead to a very fulfilling life. And so, don't ignore it, but don't make it, consume your whole life, this idea of finding that perfect career, finding that perfect job. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be part of some long-term plan. It's perfectly acceptable just to follow the secret path as it opens up before you. Go for a bit of random walk, and there's a lot of talk today about self-assessment, knowing what your values are, knowing what your skills are, and that's certainly important, but sometimes you just don't know. And that shouldn't stop you from just going forward and keep walking, because you'll find that out as you go. As you try things, it's a lot easier to know whether or not you like something by trying it rather than thinking about it, which I know is a hard thing to say to theoretical physicists. But those would be, sort of, be humble and chill out.
So I was going to say something that's a bit related and then something that's an extension of that. One is when you're a scientist, so much is on you, right? It's your name and it's your, your successes are what you're measured by, and that's a hard situation to be in. So you say you are not your work, but it's a very difficult thing to do in this kind of a field. So I think so based on that, I'll just say something that maybe is going to sound a bit hippie, trippy to you, but it's like check in with yourself a bit, right? Take a minute to kind of just listen to what you're passionate about, what makes you happy when you're not feeling well, and why that is. And I don't mean just a cold, I mean just your own sort of sanity, right? Because I think if you actually listen to yourself a little bit more, it can kind of help you whether you're pursuing an academic career or kind of tell you when maybe you got to kind of start looking at other things too. I think sometimes, the signal has to be so loud before you actually listen to it that either you are in a place that isn't good for you, or you may have missed some opportunities that you may have wanted to pursue. So I think it's just, as you know, touchy-feely as it sounds, I think it is important to kind of just know, just listen to your own self.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. Let's thank our panelists for an excellent discussion.